Hey guys, tonight we're stepping back into the frost-laced, fire-lit world of the Viking Age, where daily life was raw, beautiful, and often colder than your ex's heart. You'll open your eyes beneath a thatched roof, wrapped in thick pelts, listening to the low snores of your husband, your children, and maybe even a dog or two. The smell of old smoke clings to the timbers above, and the bite of northern air finds any crack in the wood it can. This isn't some grand saga of war and glory. This is your life, quiet, hard, and strangely poetic in its simplicity. Now, fair warning, you probably won't survive this if you're allergic to cold. Chores, or goats with attitudes. But that's half the fun, right? So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And I'd love to know, where are you watching from? And what time is it there? Drop your location and local hour in the comments. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You wake before the sun, not because of an alarm, those haven't been invented yet, but because that's how things are. The Longhouse is dark except for the faint glow of dying coals. You're cocooned in wool blankets and reindeer furs, your breath visible in the chilly air. Around you, the others sleep, your husband snoring like a wounded bear, your youngest curled into your side, one foot dangling from the shared straw-stuffed bedding. There's a kind of peace in this quiet moment, the hush before the tasks begin. But you can already hear a goat braying in the distance. It sounds angry, or maybe just hungry. The fire needs feeding. The children will soon demand porridge, and you suspect one of the dogs has peed again near the door. You sit up, muscles aching slightly from yesterday's wood chopping. Not that anyone will praise you for that. Viking women are strong by default. There's no badge of honor for hauling firewood when it's your daily reality. You shuffle to the hearth. It's low but not dead, and you carefully feed it twigs and dry moss until the flames yawn back to life. The warmth creeps across the stone floor, not fast enough for your toes. You move quickly, layering your wool tunic over a linen underdress, pulling your apron dress on and last. A brooch made of bronze, round like a full moon, secures the straps. It's not just decorative. It says, I'm a wife, a mother, and I'm not to be trifled with before breakfast. The Longhouse is one large, multi-purpose space. Livestock are penned at the far end, separated only by a low wooden partition. In winter, they share the building to provide extra warmth and, you'll admit, to add a charming scent of dung to your otherwise cozy home. It's efficient, if a bit pungent. The layout is standard central hearth, sleeping platforms along the walls, tools and baskets hanging from the beams. Some items are heirlooms, others, like the wooden bowl you carved last spring, are rough but useful. As the fire brightens, your family begins to stir. Your youngest whines and rolls over. Your oldest, only 7, but already talking like a mini Thane, asks if there's honey for breakfast. There isn't. There rarely is. Honey's expensive, and you're not made of silver. Instead, you ladle yesterday's barley porridge into the pot, add water, and stir. It smells faintly of smoke and effort. A bit of dried apple helps. Not much, but enough. Now comes the real juggling act. One hand stirs the pot. The other is fending off a toddler trying to poke the fire with a stick. You sigh, scoop her up, and balance her on your hip while barking a warning to your middle child. If you hit your brother with that spoon again, I swear by Thor's beard. This is your kingdom, not the battlefield, not the mead hall, but here, keeping the fire alive, feeding small mouths, and managing chaos with the authority of a goddess disguised as someone with wild hair and calloused hands. Outside, the village is still slumbering. Smoke curls lazily from other rooftops. Somewhere, an old man coughs. A rooster tries to crow and immediately regrets it. It's too cold for that kind of enthusiasm. And here's your first historical nugget. Viking women in many Norse settlements held significant sway over the household. You weren't just the lady of the home, you owned land, controlled livestock, and could even file for divorce if your husband didn't hold up his end of the bargain. Talk about progressive for the 9th century. But here's the quirky bit. Some graves in Sweden and Iceland show women buried with smithing tools. Historians still argue whether these women were actually blacksmiths or if the tools were symbolic, possibly spiritual, even magical. You like to imagine you'd qualify either way. You pass out the warm bowls of porridge, offering the children slices of hard cheese if they promise to stop fighting. They don't, but they eat anyway. Your husband finally wakes, scratching his beard and blinking like a confused bear. He mumbles a greeting, then stumbles out to check the canoe traps near the river. You sit for a moment, sipping hot water steeped with dried juniper. It's not tea, it's survival in a cup. Soon, you'll step outside and face the cold properly. But just now, the fire glows, the porridge warms bellies, and the Longhouse breathes with life. This is how every Viking day begins, not with a bang, but with a slow return to motion. Furs, fire, and familial noise. You brace yourself before stepping outside, because no matter how many winters you've lived through, that first shock of cold air never fails to hit like a slap from a frost giant. The moment you unlatch the heavy wooden door, a gust slices across your cheeks, sharp enough to sting, but familiar enough to ignore. You step into the dim blue haze of a Scandinavian dawn, where light doesn't so much arrive as it sighs in slowly. The village is quiet, except for the occasional bleating of livestock and the creak of wooden beams as roofs settle in the cold. Smoke puffs from the chimney holes of other long houses, creating a low fog that mixes with the rising steam of breath. It's beautiful in a bleak sort of way, like one of those melancholy ballads that makes you cry for reasons you don't quite understand. Your first stop is the pen, where the goats are already protesting your lateness. Of all the creatures you care for, they're the loudest and most dramatic. You mutter something about turning them into stew, and they bleat back like they dare you. You haul open the gate and step into the hay-strewn enclosure. The ground crunches beneath your boots, frost-bitten, uneven, full of tiny ice-covered surprises like goat droppings or yesterday's frozen turnip peelings. You move quickly, tossing feed and cutting hay with your small knife, hands working with muscle memory as your mind wanders to the 100 other things waiting for you today. Milk comes next. You sit on a lopsided wooden stool that wobbles just enough to make this whole routine slightly more dangerous than it should be. One goat, the elder of the group and appropriately named Queen Helga, glares at you before reluctantly allowing the milking. She's got opinions, and if she could talk, she'd probably run for the village council. Viking livestock were vital, especially the goats and sheep. Goats gave milk, meat, and skin, while sheep were precious for their wool. And don't forget the cows' status symbols as much as they were sustenance. A woman with 3 cows was someone, a woman with none. Well, she'd better be excellent at something else like brewing or charming the gods. The milking is rhythmic, warm milk hitting the pail with soft splashes. It's one of the few chores that brings a kind of peace, that is, until one of the younger goats decides to headbutt you in the knee. You spill a bit, sigh, and remind yourself that life in the far north builds character, or at least stronger thighs. Your children run out after you, faces still sticky with porridge. One carries a crooked stick pretending it's a sword. Another's already halfway up the nearest snowbank. You call out a warning about slipping, which they promptly ignore. You glance toward the water's edge. The river's surface is a glinting sheet of ice, with tiny swirls of mist curling from the still unfrozen center. That's where your husband is, trying his luck with the traps. If he brings back fish, you'll dry them over the fire for the coming days. If not, well, there's always more barley porridge. You usher the children back inside, their cheeks red from the cold. Little noses running freely because no one in this century believes in wiping anything unless it's bleeding. You pour the goat milk into a clay jar and set it near the hearth. Ready for cheese or butter or tonight's cooking, whatever strikes you first. Once inside, the chores keep coming. You scrape ash from the hearth. Check the bread dough you left to rise barely, and turn your attention to the toddler who's now attempting to put a fish bone up her nose. Just another morning. Here's your mainstream fact of the day. Viking women weren't just housekeepers. They managed the farms, crafted textiles, arranged marriages, oversaw slaves when applicable, and were even known to join sea voyages in rare cases. These weren't passive figures in the shadows. They were the backbone of Norse society and often the brains behind the brawn. And here's your quirky bit. Norse sagas mention women foreseeing the future during everyday tasks. Spinning thread, stirring porridge, braiding hair. Was it superstition? A narrative device. Historians still argue whether these visions were genuine mystical practices or clever metaphors for feminine intuition. Either way, as you scoop up the toddler and remove the offending fish bone with surgical precision, you do feel strangely clairvoyant, like you knew this was going to happen. The day's only just begun, and you've already soothed squabbles, milked Helga, avoided mild injury, and made decisions that would stump most modern CEOs. And now comes the best part, trying to explain to your 5-year-old that no, we cannot name the chicken Odin. The coals burn hotter now. Outside, the sun has finally pushed itself above the mountains, casting long shadows and making the snow sparkle like something out of a dream. Inside, you sit down for a moment, just a moment, on the edge of the sleeping bench. There's a cup of warm goat milk in your hands, the fire crackling, and the toddler snuggled beside you. Finally still. This is the rhythm of your life. Cold, chaotic, and endlessly full. But in between the goats, the chores, and the dirt-smudged kisses, there's something close to joy. The fire hums at your back as you rise again, this time to dress properly for the day, not just in whatever scraps you pulled on to feed goats in the dark. There's a rhythm to dressing, a kind of art, even when there's no audience but your own reflection in a polished bronze mirror. Your first layer is linen, worn soft from years of washing in icy water. Over that, a thick wool tunic in deep red. The color is no accident. Red dyes are expensive, and wearing them says something about your household's prosperity. Not wealthy enough to flaunt it, but definitely not scraping the bottom of the mead barrel either. Next comes your apron dress, woven with a blue-gray thread. The fabric smells faintly of smoke, sheep, and the herbs you hung to dry above the loom. You pull it over your head and fasten it with 2 round brooches at the shoulders. The brooches are bronze, simple but heavy, cast in a design you've seen since you were a girl. They tell others that you are married, capable, and have your own keys literally. There's a set dangling from your belt, rattling lightly as you move. You add small glass beads strung between the brooches, green and blue, with 1 cracked amber orb you still wear, even though your daughter accidentally dropped it last summer while pretending it was a dragon's eye. Your belt holds more than just keys. There's your small utility knife, a pouch of dried herbs, and a little carved bone comb for taming both your daughter's hair and your own unruly braid. Practicality reigns. But that doesn't mean you don't enjoy a little style, especially since Viking fashion doubled as social signaling before it ever became aesthetic. Here's your historical fact for today. Viking women weren't just wearing functional farm wear. The archaeological remains of female graves show elaborate jewelry, imported silk trimming from Byzantium, and dyed wool in a rainbow of shades. Even everyday wear could be surprisingly refined if you had the skills or wealth. The fringe detail, tiny leather shoes were often stuffed with moss for insulation. Yes, you walked through snow with basically a plant-based sock, and they worked, sort of, unless the snow melted, in which case you had a portable swamp in each foot. You step outside, now properly dressed, and feel a bit more like yourself. Viking society didn't give you many luxuries, but clothing was one realm where women got to shine. The brooches, beads, and belt accoutrements aren't just pretty, they're power. Your neighbor waves from across the path, a slightly crooked smile and a headscarf pulled tight. You nod back, noting her new wool cloak, probably her mother's, passed down and restitched more times than anyone remembers. Clothes weren't disposable here. A single dress could outlive a marriage. And now we hit one of those murky, scholarly debates. Some say Viking women use specific brooch styles to subtly communicate things: widowhood, fertility, clan loyalties. Others insist we're reading way too much into fashion choices made 1,000 years ago. Who's right? Maybe both. Maybe neither. That's the fun of history. You get to squint at clues and pretend you're solving a saga-sized mystery. You tug your cloak tighter and adjust the brooch that holds it shut. The wind has picked up, and there's a fine frost dancing through the air, now tiny shards of sky catching in your lashes. There's no vanity mirror here, no hair salon, no perfume, just you, wrapped in fur and wool, moving through a world that is both unforgiving and oddly elegant. Inside, your eldest daughter is playing with a broken spindle, pretending to be a vulva, a siress. She's draped a ragged shawl over her head and is whispering nonsense at the fire. You smile. Maybe she'll be one of the real ones someday. Maybe she'll just be excellent at dramatic storytelling. Either way, she's already learning the power of appearances. You kneel beside her and let her bless your brooches with an invisible spell. You play along. In a world where half the village believes the gods still walk in the forests, imagination isn't just encouraged, it's a survival skill. As the morning light finally sharpens into something you'd call day, you step into the main path through the village again, head held high, layers swishing with movement, metal glinting with pride. This isn't dressing up for fun. It's dressing up because you can. Because each piece you wear was made, some traded, or earned with work. And because you are seen, and you like that. Even if only the goats seem to notice most of the time. The cold is sharper now, but your hands have already gone numb enough that it hardly matters. You head toward the livestock pens again, this time to check the fencing, clear frozen manure, and nudge any overly dramatic goats back onto their hooves. One of them your husband's favorite, though he denies it has somehow gotten her horn stuck between two slats in the fence. Again, you sigh. This is the 4th time this week, as you ease her head back through and give her a stern look. You reflect on something quietly impressive, your life, and the lives of women like you, run on a schedule shaped entirely by instinct and experience. No parchment calendar, no clocks, just the tilt of the sun, the thickness of the frost, the hunger in your belly, and the way your knees ache when it's going to snow. You secure the gate with a loop of twisted rope and begin the next task, refilling the water trough. It involves breaking through a thin crust of ice, and your fingers ache as you scoop water from the well, the bucket creaking on its wooden handle. This part is where you start humming. Not a song with words, just something low and rhythmic. It helps you stay warm, keeps your mind busy, and occasionally freaks out the chickens. You carry the bucket carefully back to the pen, arms straining, breath rising in white curls. When you dump it into the trough, the goats fall upon it like they've been dying of thirst for days, which, of course, they haven't. Here's your historical grounding. Fact, livestock care in Viking society was largely overseen by women, especially in the absence of men during raids or sea journeys. Goats, sheep, and cattle were not only central to a household's survival, they were also sources of wealth, marriage dowries, and even legal disputes. Lose a cow and you might lose your social standing. Today's fun fringe detail, there's actual archaeological evidence of goat pens inside longhouses in the far north. That's right, some households just said, let's bring the animals in. Like it was perfectly normal. Imagine sleeping next to something that chews on its own beard and has no personal boundaries. Actually, maybe you don't have to imagine that if you have toddlers, you check the fence one last time. It's sturdy enough for now, but you'll likely have to reinforce it come spring, especially if those rumors about wolves prove true. For now, though, your herd is safe. You call to your eldest son, who's supposed to be helping, only to discover he's decided to climb onto the woodpile and declare himself king of the fjord. With a stick for a sword and his tunic tucked into his socks, he strikes a heroic pose, then immediately loses balance and falls off. You don't laugh out loud, but the chickens definitely do. He's fine. You send him to collect eggs, which he does while muttering about how kings don't handle chickens. Now that the pens are in order, you walk the narrow paths between homes, nodding to neighbors. There's a quiet camaraderie among the women here, unspoken but strong. You trade glances, a few muttered jokes, and the occasional warning about slippery patches. And now comes the moment of social grace community animal tending. A calf from 2 houses over has wandered, again, into the wrong plot of land. You help herd it back with practiced efficiency, grabbing its rope halter and murmuring softly into its ear like you're calming a drunk relative at a feast. It responds, eventually. Historians still argue whether Norse villages operated under a structured schedule of communal animal care, or if it was all informal, just women helping women, solving problems on the fly. Either way, it works. And it works because you all know each other's strengths, weaknesses, and preferred yelling tones. Once the animals are sorted, you turn your attention to the compost heap. Because if you thought Viking life was all swords and snow, let's introduce you to the thrilling world of organic waste management. You shovel out yesterday's straw, old scraps, and goat droppings into a pile that will eventually become next season's planting bed. It's a cycle, a sacred stink, and an oddly satisfying part of your daily rhythm. And here's a quiet thought you don't say out loud this work: the mud, the mess, the stubborn animals, it's grounding. It reminds you you're alive. It keeps your hands busy and your heart steady. There's no time to dwell on old griefs or new fears when there's a pig with a limp and a fence that needs fixing. The sun is a little higher now, spilling gold across the rooftops and making the snow sparkle like tiny broken mirrors. Your breath catches at the sight, not because it's new, but because it's still beautiful, even after all these years. By the time you trudge back to your longhouse, boots caked in mud and straw, your arms ache, your cheeks are raw, and your cloak smells distinctly of goat. But there's satisfaction here, in the rhythm of responsibility, in the way the village breathes around you, in the soft, almost invisible threads that tie you to every life here, 2-legged, 4-legged, or otherwise. Back in the heart of the village, your next stop isn't about hay or hearths, it's about humans. Specifically, their stories, their secrets, and their dried fish. Because like every good society, Viking villages run not just on work, but on information. You make your way down the packed snow path toward the open space near the docks, where a few stalls and benches form a loose kind of marketplace. It's not a sprawling bazaar like in the southern cities, but it's where you trade, barter, catch up, and, most importantly, gossip. Oh yes, Viking women weren't just caretakers. You were also unofficial town broadcasters, judges of character and walking news scrolls. As you approach, you greet the fish seller, a woman named Asa whose braid could be used to tether a longship. She gives you the nod low, slow, meaningful. You nod back. It's the kind of exchange that says, I know you know I know. You browse her baskets, pretending to debate whether to trade for smoked herring or dried cod. But really, you're waiting. Then she leans in. Did you hear she whispers? Bergthora's youngest. He's been sleepwalking again. This time all the way to the stone circle. You pretend to gasp. Alone? No shoes. The two of you trade goods fish for a bundle of firewood and a promise to lend her your flax comb tomorrow. Then you move on. Because information, like sour milk, doesn't get better just sitting around. You stop next at the woman who makes tallow candles. Her son is carving a piece of driftwood with surprising detail, and she's visibly trying not to hover. You admire the carving, comment on the wax quality, and receive in return a bit of news about a boat that returned early with no men, just crates of silver and one sheep that allegedly speaks when it's drunk. You're skeptical, but you write it down in your mind anyway. You never know what might be useful in the next village meeting. Here's your historical fact for the day Viking society valued women's voices. While they may not have stood beside men in council meetings, their influence in household decisions, matchmaking, trading, and even community conflicts was undeniable. In Iceland's Gragas law code, women could be legal witnesses and property owners. Your voice, it mattered. Now the fun bit. There's actual mention in some sagas of women spreading curses through gossip. Words were more than tools, they were weapons. Whispers weren't harmless. Some believed a sharp tongue could twist fate. And historians still argue whether these were metaphors or genuine beliefs. Could gossip really curse a man's luck in battle? If you've ever lived in a small town, you probably know the answer. You pass a few more stalls, one selling combs made from elk horn, another displaying dyed yarn so bright you wonder who smuggled them from the south. At each, the dance is the same. Trade goods, trade news, trade glances. What isn't said often carries more weight than what is. Someone mentions that a seal carcass washed ashore down by the cove. Another mutters about strange lights seen over the fjord at night. You file these away too. You may not be a skald, but you know the rhythm of stories, and you know when one's just beginning. You sit for a moment on the low stone wall near the well, letting the sun hit your face. It's weak, watery, but welcome. You think about how each woman here carries an invisible ledger: who owes what, who married whom, which family is strong this winter and which is barely hanging on. This social economy is as vital as the livestock pens, maybe more. Because a good word from the right person can open doors. A bad one that can close a marriage proposal, or worse, get someone accused of witchcraft. A girl you recognize, barely 10 winters old, approaches, holding a woven pouch. She offers you a small lump of sea salt in exchange for a story. You laugh, only one you ask. She nods seriously. And so, you tell her the tale of the whale that got stuck in the bay and cried for its mother, and how the gods heard it and turned the sea to glass so it could slide home. You make it up as you go, like you always do. She listens, wide-eyed, then runs off. You doubt she believed every word, but she'll tell someone, and that someone will add their own twist. And just like that, a legend is born. As you walk home with your arms full of dried fish and new information, you feel the subtle buzz that only a good gossip run can give. You're more than warmed, you're connected. Before you reach your longhouse, you pause and glance back at the cluster of women still talking, still bartering. There's laughter now, and a few raised voices. Something's being disputed over a cracked jug. Typical. The truth is, while your world is built on stone and snow, it's held together by stories. The ones you trade, the ones you overhear, the ones you tell yourself to sleep at night. Because in this far north life, there's no greater survival skill than knowing who's doing what and with whom. Back home, your bundle of dried fish finds its way onto a hook near the hearth, where it will join a rotating gallery of supplies, herbs, cheese, smoked meats, dried roots, each one hard-earned, and none ever taken for granted. The children are momentarily occupied. One is making a doll from straw, Another is trying to braid the dog's fur. You let them be. It gives you the perfect excuse to settle near the doorway where the winter light spills in. This is your favorite corner, a triangle of warmth and clarity where you can sit and work with your hands, watching the village move past and listening, always listening. You settle into your seat, basket beside you, and pull out your weaving. Today, you're working on a strip of tablet-woven trim, fine enough to impress, sturdy enough to last. The tablets are small, flat pieces of carved bone with holes punched at each corner. You thread wool through each hole, turn the tablets rhythmically, and the design emerges like magic diamonds, spirals, runes. Each twist of your fingers is part of a lineage as old as the hills around you. You hum again, that same tuneless melody. It helps the weaving stay even. It also keeps your youngest from trying to poke the loom with a spoon, which is always a win. Textile work isn't just a pastime here. It's a life. Your tunics, cloaks, bedding, wall hangings, all of it born from scratch, from sheep to shears, spindle to warp. Every thread passes through your hands. You card the wool, spin it, dye it with plant-based brews that smell like cabbage and swamp. And finally, you weave. Hours become days. And still the pattern isn't quite done. But when it is, it'll wrap around someone you love. That makes the aching fingers worth it. Your historical anchor today, Viking women were master textile producers. In fact, woven goods were so valued that they often functioned as currency. The quality of your cloth could increase your family's status more than silver. In burial sites, it's not uncommon to find women buried with shears, spindle whirls, and loom weights as if they were going to keep working in the afterlife. Now for something a little more odd. Archaeological evidence shows some Viking women used wool dyed with imported indigo or madder root, which had to be traded from hundreds of miles away. That means your closet might have connections all the way to Persia or the Frankish kingdoms. Historians still argue whether this was through direct contact, second-hand trade, or a really ambitious middleman with great taste in tunics. As the rhythm of your weaving settles in, your thoughts drift. You remember the first time your mother let you try the loom. You were 6, and you broke 3 tablets before threading a single fiber. She laughed and made you start again, and again. By the 3rd winter, you could make a clean edge. By the 5th, you were dyeing your own skeins. The sounds of daily life blur into a soft backdrop clucks from the chicken coop, the distant rasp of someone splitting logs, a baby wailing from 2 houses down, the kind of noises that only feel like noise when you're new here. To you, they're lullabies of the land. Your daughter joins you after a while, settling beside you with her own little hoop of linen. She's sewing crooked lines that lean a little more chaotic than decorative. But she's proud. She wants to embroider her name in runes, even though she still mixes up the letters. You help her with the symbols U, N, and tell her what they mean. Not just their sounds, but their spirits. Because runes aren't just an alphabet here. They're spells, intentions. You don't use them lightly. Not on cloth, not on stone, and definitely not when carving them into someone's house beam unless you want a long discussion about curses, theft, or romantic betrayal. She asks if you ever stitched a curse into someone's hem. You grin. Once. She gasps. What did it say? You whisper that he would always itch, but never know why. She laughs so hard she drops her needle. These are the best hours. The ones that don't make it into the sagas. Not war, not fire, not gods or giants, just thread, fingers, sunlight, and the sound of your daughter's giggles. And while you sit there, someone walks past, someone you're not especially fond of, and you suddenly remember the fringe of your apron needs mending. And wouldn't it be just so easy to stitch a little rune in there? Just one. For luck. Of course. Maybe. Probably. The tablet weaving continues, your hands steady. Your daughter eventually quiet beside you, absorbed in her wobbly stitching. Outside, a raven caws and hops across the snow, leaving behind little claw tracks that look suspiciously like runes themselves. You finish the last row of your pattern and smooth it flat. The design is balanced, tight, and most importantly, yours. You made it. From nothing, and it will outlast the winter. Later in the day, when the sun has climbed as high as it dares, and let's be honest, that's still pretty low, you wrap a warm shawl around your shoulders and step beyond the edge of the village. No children, no goats, no bartering, just you, the trees, and a quiet that stretches wider than the fjord. You follow the path that curves through a thicket of pine and birch, snow crunching beneath your boots, breath rising in soft clouds. There's a place just up the hill, tucked behind a mossy outcrop, where time seems to fold. It's not marked on any map, but everyone in the village knows it. The stump. It's older than memory, maybe older than your gods. Thick, gnarled, half-rotted. It's the kind of thing most would pass by without a second glance. But you know better. This is where the old powers are strongest. Not the gods of lightning and war, but the quiet ones, the whispering ones, the ones who don't make a scene. You kneel before the stump, clearing a small patch of snow. From a pouch at your belt, you take a bit of bread, a strand of your own hair, and a carved bone token. The bread is an offering. The hair is a sign. The token, a long-held charm passed down from your mother, who swore it helped her fertility, though she also once said the same thing about fermented cabbage. You lay them out carefully, whispering a few words not loud enough to carry, not specific enough to be a request, just presence, a thank you, a please keep my children alive through the winter if it's not too much trouble kind of prayer. Here's your historical anchor. Norse religion wasn't just about Odin and Thor striding through the clouds. Daily worship often centered around land spirits, ancestors, and rituals carried out by women in quiet corners of their homes or forests. The term ve, meaning a sacred space, didn't always mean temples. Sometimes it meant a stump just like this. Now the quirky bit in parts of Norway and Iceland. Offerings of milk, butter, or even silver were hidden in tree roots or buried beneath rocks for the Landvetter local spirits said to protect the land. And historians still argue whether these spirits were rooted in pre-Viking animism or developed alongside Norse mythology as an entirely parallel belief system. You don't know for certain, of course, but you feel something here. A hush, a warmth, even in the snow. Maybe it's just your imagination, or maybe it's something older, watching you with a patience only trees can manage. You sit a while longer, hands in your lap, the wind rustling your shawl. This is the part of the day that belongs only to you. No chores, no decisions. Just a woman and the woods and whatever lies between the trees. When you rise, your knees protest a little. You press your palm to the stump and whisper one last word, tuck. Thank you for listening, for doing nothing at all, for being here when everything else moves too fast. The walk back is slower, more thoughtful. You pass a twisted tree you once swore looked like Loki's face, and another whose bark peels like old parchment. You collect a few bits of pine resin and a sprig of dried heather for the house, for the mood. As the village comes into view, you feel different, not lighter, exactly, but steadier. You pass another woman heading toward the woods, her own pouch tucked into her belt. You don't speak, just nod. These things don't need words. When you return home, the children are squabbling over a carved bear toy, and your husband is trying and failing to repair a cracked bowl using fish glue and too much confidence. You take the bowl gently, Smile at him and reach for your own stash of pitch. He lets you. You're better at this. While you work, the heather you gathered rests on the hearth. Not for decoration, for luck. Maybe. You'll never admit it out loud, but you touch it whenever the wind howls too loud at night. Because in a world of storms and hunger and gods who don't always answer, sometimes a twig on the mantle is the strongest magic of all. The smell of simmering broth creeps through the Longhouse, curling into every fold of fabric and strand of hair. It's not luxurious turnip and fish bones, thickened with barley, but it's hot, and it promises comfort. You stir slowly, the long-handled spoon making lazy circles as the fire pops and snaps. One child's dozing in the corner, the other's playing some incomprehensible game involving antlers and a blanket. You don't ask. Dinner, like everything else in your world, isn't just about food. It's ritual, it's presence, and it's usually noisy. You call the family to gather not with a shout, but a tone, just sharp enough to cut through play, but warm enough that they come willingly. Your husband stomps in, brushing snow from his shoulders, the scent of fish and wood smoke clinging to his beard. He sniffs the air and nods in approval. It's the Viking version of a Michelin star. The stew is ladled into carved wooden bowls, each one slightly uneven but dearly familiar. The children settle in, knees knocking, spoons clattering, cheeks flushed. You sit last, because of course you do. You offer a short thanks not just to the gods, but to the animals, the sea, the earth, and frankly, to yourself. No one else chopped those roots with frozen fingers at dawn. Here's your historical fact. For the evening, Viking meals were usually simple but nourishing. Stews made of fish, root vegetables, and grains were staples. And homes often had a hanging pot over the hearth where the stew was kept going for days like a living soup that changed personalities daily. Now here's the weird part. Some sources mention a fermented fish pudding called hakar, a dish so pungent that even modern Scandinavian chefs have to eat it outdoors. Historians still argue whether such dishes were everyday staples or ritual food served on special occasions, or if they were culinary hazing. You pass a hunk of dried bread across the bench, trading it for a smear of goat cheese. It's tough. You soften it by dipping it in broth and don't think too hard about what part of the goat the cheese came from. Conversation over dinner is less about news everyone's already caught up and more about invention. The children reenact a saga they've stitched together from half-remembered tales and wild guesses. A sea serpent features heavily. So does a talking fox who claims to be your cousin. You laugh. Your husband laughs. Even the baby giggles and smacks the table with both hands like a tiny berserker. And for a moment, the Longhouse feels brighter. The fire glows deeper. Your muscles loosen. You let the spoon rest in your bowl. Lean back against the timber wall and breathe. It's easy to think Viking life was all raids and rage. But this is most of it. The sitting, the warmth, the small comfort of a full belly, and people who drive you crazy in a way that you wouldn't trade for a ship full of silver. You clear the bowls afterward. Well, mostly. One child tries to sneak away before chores. You call them back with just a raised eyebrow. The power of matriarchy. Not flashy, but deeply effective. Leftovers, such as they are, get sealed in a clay pot and tucked near the hearth where the warmth will keep it from freezing. The wooden ladle gets a rinse from snow melt water, then a rub with a dry cloth. You hang it from its peg, where it'll wait for tomorrow. Cleaning is quiet. Just the crackle of fire, the scrape of bowls, the thud of feet on the plank floor. There's something soothing about it. Predictable, unlike the weather, or the livestock, or the dreams that sometimes haunt you after a hard winter's night. Your husband lifts a heavy fur from the chest, drapes it over the sleeping bench, and sits. He doesn't say much, but then again, he rarely does. Instead, He hands you a carved bit of wood, a charm he's been working on. It's a bare lumpy, but with personality. You smile and tuck it into your belt pouch, and just like that, the Longhouse starts its slow slide towards sleep. You bank the fire, pile on more peat, and place a stoneware bowl of water near the coals to keep the air moist through the night. Your children are already half asleep, piled like puppies on the furs. There's one last thing you do before lying down. You take the straw-stuffed pad you use as a pillow and give it a solid fluffing. Not for comfort, but because sometimes the mice like to sneak in. It's not elegant, but it's real. The last thing you hear before you close your eyes is the soft snore of the dog at your feet and the wind pressing against the door like a ghost with cold hands. You fall asleep knowing the stew pot is full. The children are fed, and the goat didn't escape today. You call that a win. You wake not to the rooster's call because, frankly, the rooster is unreliable, but to the distinct sound of dripping. Not just any drip, the rhythmic kind. That slow, traitorous beat of snow melting through the thatch and into a wooden bucket you placed there last week. You were hoping it would hold. It didn't. You sit up slowly, the furs heavy and warm. One child sprawled across your shins like a sack of turnips. The fire's gone to embers, but enough warmth lingers to keep the bite of morning at bay. You rise, stretch, and poke the coals with the fire iron. A few sparks leap up, and with some coaxing, the flames begin again. There's a quiet satisfaction in building something from almost nothing. The leak is worse than it looked. You climb the bench, press your hand to the damp thatch, and sigh. Nothing to be done until it dries. You tuck the bucket back under the drip and mentally add roof patching to the ever-growing scroll of the tasks. With the fire revived and the youngest still asleep, you take advantage of this rare quiet to prepare a small morning offering, just a splash of milk and a crust of bread, placed in the hearth corner for the husfreyja, the spirit of the house. No one really knows what she looks like, but everyone agrees she's best kept happy. Angry house spirits are like splinters in your foot small, invisible, and guaranteed to ruin your day. Here's your historical truth. Many Viking households practiced some form of domestic ritual or offering to unseen spirits. These customs blended Norse paganism with older animistic beliefs, resulting in traditions that lived on for centuries, even after Christian conversion. And your offbeat gem for today in parts of early Scandinavia. People believed a ghostly house snake lived beneath the floorboards and guarded the home. Feeding it, in some tales, brought prosperity. Forget, and your cheese might curdle mysteriously. Historians still argue whether the snake was symbolic of fertility, wealth, or just a remnant of older, pre-Viking folklore slithering its way through the cultural cracks. As the children stir, you start the breakfast grind, flatbread, goat cheese, and last night's barley reheated over the fire. No cinnamon, no eggs, sunny side up. But it fills the belly. One child refuses the porridge, claims it's haunted. You suggest it might be the same ghost who steals socks. This backfires. Now they're crying and refusing porridge. Parenting. Your husband is already gone out to the fjord to check the nets. You envy him the quiet, but not the cold. You once fell through river ice as a girl and still dream of it sometimes, the silence beneath, the suffocating pressure. So you stay on land. Thank you very much. After breakfast, the roof calls. Literally. It groans under the weight of the snow. You throw on your boots and grab the long-handled roof rake, trudging around the house to dislodge the burden before something collapses. You tug, pull, whack the beam. Snow crashes down in heavy, wet waves, nearly burying your boots. You get a face full, naturally. The chickens scream in alarm. The dog runs for cover. You mutter something unflattering about the god's sense of humor. And then comes the fall. Not yours. The rake's handle snaps. Clean in half. You stand there for a moment, holding the broken ends like some sort of tragic poem. You could cry, or scream, or laugh. You pick laugh, because honestly, what else can you do? Repairs. Then, you dig out the backup pole, a bent piece of driftwood you'd hoped to save for a fishing spear. You lash it to the rake head with twine and, against all odds, it holds. You finish clearing the roof, triumphant in your temporary engineering. That's the Viking woman's superpower, relentless adaptability. If the gods send you a broken tool, you make a better one, or at least a worse one that works just long enough. Inside, you change into dry socks and rub warmth back into your fingers. You give the porridge one more stir, if only to spite the ghost. You nudge the roof drip bucket slightly to the left. You hang the broken rake bits on a hook. They'll make decent fire starters next week. And then only then you allow yourself to sit. One small moment. You press your hand to the dog's side, feel its ribs rising and falling. You look around at your half-messy, half-perfect longhouse, the sagging rafters, the soot-dark walls, the children squabbling over a game involving rocks and deeply flawed rules. This is the rhythm of survival, 1,000 small fixes, one clever patch at a time. No one's writing sagas about the woman who saved her family with twine and a bent stick. But you'd like to think maybe someone should. Midday creeps in with its usual hush, as though even the sun is too tired to do much. You take this time, this fragile, golden sliver of stillness, to turn your attention to healing. Not your own, necessarily. Others. Because every woman in this village, at some point, becomes a healer by default. You've been doing it since you were old enough to smear honey on cuts and pretend it worked. The herb shelf near your hearth smells of dried roots, crushed leaves, and the kind of bitterness that makes even the bravest children flinch. You've sorted everything into little leather pouches, knotted linen bundles, and reused fish bladder containers that now hold dried juniper berries. Your tools aren't fancy, just a wooden mortar, a pestle, and a few sharp knives. But in your hands, they're enough. You grind dried yarrow today. For bleeding, not that anyone's bleeding yet, but give it time. You mix it with thyme and a pinch of sea salt, then spoon the blend into a linen wrap. It joins the others in your just-in-case stash alongside the moldy bread poultice. Don't laugh. It works. The burnt wool ash, also not a joke. And your mother's secret cold cure, which is suspiciously similar to mead with extra honey. Here's your historical fact. Viking women were often midwives and herbalists, responsible for both everyday health and emergency care. Knowledge of healing was handed down orally. There were no scrolls or textbooks, just memory, intuition, and lots of trial and error. Usually involving plants that looked suspiciously like poisonous cousins. And the fringe details some healing rituals involved tying herbs into knots while chanting specific rhymes. The words weren't just decorative, they were believed to carry power. Historians still argue whether this was medicinal, magical, or just something to keep terrified patients distracted. Possibly all three. This afternoon, a neighbor knocks with a boy in tow, her son red-faced and miserable with a cough that sounds like he swallowed a goat. You feel his forehead, hot, his breath not sweet. You make a decoction of pine bark and honey, wrapped in a cloth and steeped in hot water. It smells like a forest and tastes like punishment. He gags, but drinks it anyway. You rub a salve of lard, garlic, and beeswax on his chest. He scowls. You tell him it'll make him smell so bad the sickness runs away. He smiles, despite himself. Healing here isn't about miracles. It's about presence, about kneeling beside someone, knowing exactly which root to boil and how to distract a crying child with a carved bear. Your tools are humble, but your role absolutely sacred. While the boy naps beside the fire, you check on your stash of dried angelica and elecampane. Running low. You'll need to harvest more in spring if the frost doesn't kill the patch by the stream. The memory of last summer's gathering trip floats in, wading through knee-high grass, brushing away biting flies, and laughing with your cousin when you both fell into a bog. Healing has never been clean work. You glance out the door. A neighbor's husband limps past, his legs still stiff from an old wound. You'd offered a salve. He'd said, "I'll let the gods handle it." You'd replied, "They seem busy." He'd used the salve. He's walking. Enough said. Sometimes, women come to you quietly asking for something to help with pain that isn't physical. You know those herbs too. You never ask questions. Just hand over a pouch with instructions and a look that says, "I understand." Other times, you deal with childbirth, loud, messy, glorious chaos. You've helped deliver 6 babies in this village, each one screaming like Thor himself. You still remember the first. You were shaking more than the mother, but it all turned out fine. Sort of. The child has a permanent squint but is otherwise healthy. You stir a pot of boiling water with dried sage floating on top. You're cleaning cloths in it. Your hands sting from the heat, but you press on, because sterilization is a thing even if no one calls it that yet. You just know that sage and hot water keep death away better than a bare rag. Outside, someone's shouting. You pop your head out and see 2 young men arguing over a sheep with an injured leg. You sigh. Not your business. Until one of them says, "Ask her. She'll know." Of course, you examine the sheep. It's limping, clearly bruised. You show them how to wrap the leg with strips of old linen and how to brew a barley mash to keep it eating. One of them stares at you like you just conjured a miracle. You didn't. You just paid attention to a lot of sheep. Back inside, you write a note on a bit of birch bark, just a list of herbs to restock. You'll trade for some, gather others. You'll patch up more children, soothe more joints, and, if the gods are generous, not catch anything in the process. You sit near the fire again, nursing a cup of warm juniper tea, the sharp scent clearing your sinuses. The boy on the bench stirs, coughs, and promptly falls back asleep. You tuck another fur around him. In a world where fevers still kill and wounds still fester, being a healer isn't about magic. It's about showing up, knowing what leaf to chew, what words to say, and when to just sit beside someone and hold their hand while the gods do what they will. And today, the gods seem to be in a good mood. By late afternoon, the sky has already started dimming, smearing soft gray and lavender across the horizon. You tighten your cloak and step outside again. This time, not for chores or healing, but for learning. Because even in a world of snow and stew, your mind needs feeding too. You head toward the far end of the village, where the elder woman lives, the one everyone calls Tova the Sharp. Not because she's unkind, but because her words cut through nonsense like a knife through fresh curd. She's your closest thing to a teacher. Even if she never claims the title, you bring her a pouch of dried thyme in exchange for a story. That's the deal. Her hut smells of wood smoke, fermented apples, and dusty parchment. She beckons you inside without looking up from her carving an intricate spiral pattern on a long slat of wood. "You're late," she mutters. "You're not." That's just how she says hello. You sit near the fire, hands in your lap. She talks. Today's story is about Freya, not the goddess of love and beauty from the pretty brooches, but the Freya who rides into battle with half of the honored dead, who cries tears of gold and wears a cloak of falcon feathers. The version of Freya most people forget when they're too busy fussing over who gets the last honey cake at feast day. As Tova speaks, her words weave into images a battlefield churning with ice and blood, a great hall lit with torches and echoing with songs, a woman standing tall with a sword in one hand and a child in the other. Freya, in her many forms, a goddess not of either or, but both and. Here's your historical truth. Women in Viking society were not only expected to maintain oral traditions, they were often the primary keepers of them. Sagas, songs, legal formulas, and family trees were preserved in memory, passed down with precision. Men told tales too, of course, but around the hearth, it was usually women's voices that carved the past into the present. And now, for the curious fringe, some sagas suggest that Seires's Volur were not just fortune-tellers, but walking repositories of history. They spoke in riddles, verses, and fragments, like human libraries with attitude. Historians still argue whether their trance-like rituals were actual spiritual practices or theatrical performances with political clout. You suspect the answer is both. Tova finishes her tale with a shrug. That's one version. She says, there are others. Doesn't matter which is true. What matters is which one lives. You nod, the phrase lodging in your mind like a warm stone. What matters is which one lives. Before you go, she hands you a carved bead, simple, round, with a single spiral etched on it. For your thread, she says, put it where it'll remind you that stories tangle, but they also bind. You pocket it with a quiet thank you and step back into the deepening chill. As you walk home, you catch sight of another neighbor practicing runes in the snow with a stick, muttering aloud. Not for magic, just practice. It's like watching someone write poetry with their feet freezing. You admire the commitment. Back home, the Longhouse is warm, dim, and already leaning into sleepiness. But you're not quite ready to let go of the world outside. You light a tallow lamp, settle by the hearth, and pull out your own bit of learning a runic pattern you've been working into your weaving. Not a spell, just a phrase your grandmother used to say. Something about strength being quieter than anger. You sketch it on a scrap of hide, testing the strokes. Each line has weight, each angle, intention. Writing isn't just about memory, it's about anchoring something in the world, so it doesn't slip away. One of your daughters asks what it means. You hesitate. Then you tell her. She nods slowly and starts copying it with her fingertip in the ash near the hearth. You don't correct her. Let her feel it before she learns it. This is how knowledge lives, not on scrolls, not behind walls, but passed hand to hand, word to word, gesture to gesture, from Tova to you, from you to your daughter, like fire passed from one torch to the next. You finish your sketch, roll it carefully, and tie it with a strip of wool, not to hide it, but to keep it safe. There are wolves and winters out there, but inside, you've got words, memory, and time. Evening in the far north doesn't arrive like a polite guest. It seeps in, slow and total, wrapping the village in velvet blue shadows and frost-tipped silence. The sky turns dusky plum, stars beginning to prick the darkness above like tiny spearheads in a great dome. You light a second lamp, then a third, until the Longhouse glows with flickering halos of yellow gold. This time of day isn't just a pause between work and sleep. It's a threshold, a soft in-between where stories deepen, tools are set aside, and reflection begins to simmer beneath the surface of every small gesture. You gather the children, not to lecture, but to listen. They sit in a half circle on the floor, some on pelts, one tucked into your side, another leaning against the dog, who seems to have accepted his role as both foot warmer and unwilling pillow. You don't open a book, you are the book. And tonight's chapter, something old, something strange. You tell them of a Draugr, a walking corpse from a distant saga, not just undead, but jealous, powerful, territorial, the kind that guards treasure and takes offense if you mow your grass too loudly. The children are thrilled. One gasps, another whispers. What if there's one under the house? You pause just long enough to make them squirm, but then you shift the tale. The Draugr is defeated not by sword, but by cleverness, by a woman who lured him into a hollow log, then sealed it shut with runes and spit and just a bit of fermented herring. The kids wrinkle their noses. That wouldn't work. One says, that's what makes it a story. You answer, your historical truth here storytelling was as essential as fire. Viking families didn't just tell sagas to entertain. They used them to pass on history, morality, warnings, and wit. The boundaries between truth and tale weren't always clear. And frankly, no one minded. If it taught a lesson or brought a laugh, it was worth repeating. Now your eccentric nugget, some archaeologists believe certain burial mounds were intentionally built with features meant to keep the dead from rising stone slabs, iron pins, even decapitation. Historians still argue whether these were practical defenses against grave robbers or literal anti-zombie measures. Either way, you make a mental note to inspect Grandpa's burial site, just in case. The stories wind down. One child's eyes are closed, their head on your lap. Another's tracing a pattern in the dirt floor, probably a ship, or a monster, or both. You stroke their hair, not speaking. No need. The quiet is thick and content. Once they're tucked into their fur piles, you move through the Longhouse, checking things in that absent-minded, experienced way of someone who no longer notices how much she notices. The door latch tight, the water jar half full, the hearth banked with peat, glowing just enough. Your husband stands at the threshold, having just come in from one last walk through the paddock. He smells of cold wind and wood smoke. He nods to you, wordless. It's the kind of nod that says, the goats are fine. The world didn't end. I'm still here. You return it. You share a seat on the low bench, both of you staring into the coals, letting the heat lick at your shins. You talk about little things, who needs new boots, when to smoke more fish, whether that boy from the next village might make a decent match for your cousin. You pretend not to notice that he's working up to asking if the broken rake is his fault. You save him the trouble. It snapped because it was old, you say, much like your knees. He laughs through his nose. Peace restored. And then just before the full dark sets in, you step outside one last time. The snow crunches under your boots like crisp bread. You tilt your face up to the stars. There they are, all of them, clear and cold and close enough to feel like a ceiling rather than a sky. You whisper their names: Orion, Thor's belt, the goat star, some real, some made up generations ago, passed through lips long returned to earth. You breathe them out like prayers, because for all your weaving and healing and storytelling, there's something deeper that anchors you here. The land, the silence, the slow, constant churn of seasons and stars that neither rush nor wait. You head back in, shaking snow from your cloak, already knowing you'll dream of frost giants tonight, probably because of the Draugr tale. You don't mind. Giants don't scare you. You've raised children. You've patched roofs. You've kept soup hot through a week of storm. Giants don't stand a chance. The wind shifts overnight. When you step outside in the early morning hush, it's from the north, now sharper, hungrier, and carrying the kind of chill that slices straight through wool. You brace yourself, pulling your cloak tighter, and squint toward the fjord. Ice is beginning to crawl across the edges, clinging to rocks like silver moss. Winter isn't coming. It's already halfway in the door. Today is storage day. Not glamorous, not dramatic, but essential. Because surviving the far north isn't about one great act of heroism. It's about dozens of tiny acts of preparation, over and over and over. You head to the drying racks, first reaching up to check the bundles of fish and meat, now leathery and stiff. You test a few for mold, shake snow from the hooks, and gently brush away a patch of frost with your sleeve. The salted cod looks good. Better than last year. The smoke from your little shed did its job, even if it made you cough like a seal for a week. Next root cellar. You lift the trap door with a grunt, stepping into the dark, earth-smelling hollow where your stores are tucked into straw-lined baskets and clay pots. Turnips, onions, dried apples, nuts, and a questionable-looking jar of pickled herring that's probably fine. Probably. Your historical nugget today. Viking homes often had some form of storage pit or cellar, lined with straw, moss, or seaweed to insulate food from both heat and deep freeze. Preservation was everything, especially when winters lasted 7 months and grocery stores were roughly 1,000 years in the future. And your curious extra details, some households hung carved charms over their food stores, little wooden figures, iron runes, or even dried animal bladders intended to protect the goods from rot, theft, or supernatural interference. Historians still argue whether these were folk magic, superstition, or just early food labeling with flair. Back above ground, you stack more peat near the firewood pile. You're low on birch, but you've got enough driftwood and chopped pine to get through a few more weeks. Your husband hauls over a sack of dried dung from the goats. Not ideal, but you nod your thanks. Fuel is fuel. You take inventory by memory, reciting aloud the list in your head. Dried meats, 4 jars of fish oil, a barrel of grain, the emergency pot of honey, 2 wheels of hard cheese, well, 1.5 now, 10 pairs of mittens, and enough wool to clothe a small saga. It's not perfect, but it's enough. You hope. Inside, the Longhouse becomes a workshop. You pull out old cloaks and start mending them, adding patches to the elbows, reinforcing seams, replacing worn-out ties with twisted flax cords. The children help by pretending the mending basket is a dragon hoard. Fine, as long as the dragon folds the tunics afterward. As you work, the dog noses at your leg. You glance down. He's chewing something suspicious. You pull it from his mouth. It's a chunk of smoked elk. You follow the trail across the floor, behind the barrel, under a bench, and find where he's been raiding your stash. You lecture him. He looks ashamed, for half a second, then sneezes directly on your wool. You sigh and throw him a bone. You both know he's going to do it again. In the corner, your daughter is stitching rabbit fur onto the inside of a hood. She sticks her tongue out as she concentrates, and you catch a sudden glimpse of yourself at her age. Same brow furrow, same awkward tension in the fingers. You don't correct her stitch, let her learn it the long way. That's how you did. Midday slips past in a rhythm of folding, cutting, tying, wrapping. It's quiet work, but not mindless. Your thoughts wander sometimes to next season, sometimes to last year, sometimes to people no longer here. You glance at a fur hanging above the door. Your uncle's. He died 3 winters ago, and you still wear the mittens he made. You don't say it aloud, but it feels like keeping part of him alive. In this world, memory isn't just emotional, it's practical. If you remember how someone carved a snowshoe frame or tied a net, you remember them. A child sneezes. You add boil more pine syrup to your mental list. Later, you bring out the waxed linen wraps, carefully folded packs that contain your family's most precious non-food items. A flint striker, extra needles, a comb carved from bone, 2 coins, a bead made of amber. Not much, but everything important. You check each one, re-wrap, re-stack, then, as dusk creeps in again, you tie your storage chest shut with twine and press a thumbprint into the knot. Not a spell, just a habit, a touch of your presence left behind. That evening, as the family eats their stew and listens to your youngest describe how she definitely saw a bear today. It might have been a very hairy man. You feel something rare, a sliver of confidence. Not peace is fleeting, but preparedness. Your stores are full. Your cloaks are mended. The dog only stole half a fish. Winter can come. You're ready. The next morning arrives wrapped in silence, thick, snowy, and undisturbed. No wind, no distant hammering, just the weight of fresh snowfall pressing gently over everything like a thick wool blanket over a dozing world. You step outside, and your boots disappear with a muffled crunch. Every path, fence, and rock has been erased. Even the goat pen looks like an untouched field. You love mornings like this. Not because they're easy gods, no, but because they demand nothing but presence. The snow slows everything down, even time. You scoop a path to the well, swinging your hips with each shovel full so the weight doesn't strain your back. The snow is powdery now, but you know it'll freeze by nightfall. That's when it becomes a problem. So you move quickly, efficiently. Your body knows this rhythm the way it knows how to rock a baby or stir a pot without looking. It's been trained by years of snow, ice, and consequence. By mid-morning, the village is starting to come alive. Thin trails of smoke rise from rooftops. Someone is chopping wood. You hear the high pitch of a boy yelling something about a sled. A woman 2 houses over is calling for her hens in a voice that would make a raven reconsider its life choices. Today, after the snow work, you're spinning wool. You settle by the fire, spindle in hand, pulling thread from a bundle of fleece. Twist, draw, wind, repeat. It's meditative, the kind of work that lets the mind wander while the hands remember every motion. The wool warms in your palms, fibers soft and stubborn. Here's your solid fact for the day. Viking women were master textile workers. Spinning and weaving weren't just chores, they were industry. Textiles were so valuable they were used as currency in some places, and cloth production was central to a household's economy. Women like you literally spun the wealth of the family into being. And here's the odd bit. Spindle whorls, those small weights used in spinning, have been found in graves across Scandinavia, often in women's burials. Some are beautifully decorated, carved with symbols. Historians still argue whether these markings were decorative, symbolic, or part of some textile-based divination system. Imagine telling fortunes through wool. You'd be unbeatable. You work the spindle slowly, pausing to feel for irregularities, adjusting tension like a musician tuning a lyre. The thread grows longer, tighter, a thin line of usefulness stretching into the future. Your youngest watches, mimicking your movements with a stick. The result is less thread, more tangled chaos. But you nod approvingly. She'll get it. Your loom is set up along the back wall, wooden, upright, as tall as you. Strips of finished fabric hang like proud banners. Some dyed with lichen and onion skin, others plain but sturdy. You measure cloth not by its beauty, but by its warmth, its wear, its memory. You weave a little this afternoon. Each shuttle pass a heartbeat. Over, under, beat. Over, under, beat. The dog snores. A pot of broth simmers. One of the children hums without realizing it, tuneless and sweet. You think of your mother, of her hands guiding yours on your first loom, of how she used to hum too, of how she made your wedding cloak thick, soft, with blue bands woven in like waves. You still wear it on feast days. You've repaired it 4 times. That makes it better, not worse. Weaving is storytelling in its own way. Every thread is a decision, every color a moment. You once wove a cloth entirely from storm gray wool because the winter had been so cruel. It felt dishonest to make anything cheerful. You still use that blanket. It's scratchy, but honest. By late afternoon, you step back outside, breathing in the sharpness of snow-scrubbed air. The fjord is quieter now, ice creeping in thicker. No boats today. The men fish from under the ice now, or not at all. You nod to a neighbor who's loading firewood into a sled. He nods back. That silent winter nod that means still alive, good. At home, you set aside the finished thread and tuck it into a cloth bag. Tomorrow, it'll be dyed, or not. Maybe it'll stay raw, honest, and winter-colored. There's beauty in simplicity that night, while your family sleeps. You take one last turn around the Longhouse. You check the door latch. You stir the embers. You pull a wool blanket higher over your son's shoulders, brushing the hair from his face. The quiet is so complete. It feels like you've slipped outside of time. You sit by the hearth a moment longer. Your spindle rests beside you. A tool, a weapon, a legacy. Tomorrow, the snow will thaw or freeze harder. The thread will break or stretch further. The work will repeat, and you will rise to meet it, as you always do. Because you're not just spinning wool, you're spinning survival. Tonight, the wind returns, not sharp and slicing like before, but low and moaning. It curls through cracks in the Longhouse walls, whistles across the roof beams, and taps its long fingers on the door. You don't need to look outside to know what kind of night it is. The kind that makes even the gods pull their cloaks tighter and mutter a prayer into the firelight. You stir from your bed pile with a groan, careful not to disturb the two children tangled at your feet. The fire's burned low again, just red coals hiding under a blanket of ash. You squat, add a log, blow gently. It flares just enough. The cold has settled into your bones. You wrap your cloak tighter and go through the house, quiet as a snow owl, checking, listening, protecting. The goats shuffle outside in the pen. You hear them faintly. If one were in distress, you'd know. Their bleats would cut through even a blizzard. But tonight, they're just huddled and sleepy, their warm breath frosting their noses. You return to the hearth. Sit, listen. There's something about these final hours, when the world narrows down to four walls. A crackling fire, and the rise and fall of familiar breathing that makes you aware of time. Not the hours of the day, but the long time. Generations. The thread between you and every woman before you who ever sat by firelight with a spindle. A story, and too many things on her mind to sleep. You pull out a bit of mending, a tunic with a rip. You stitch, not because it's urgent, but because the motion is comforting. Stitch. Breathe. Listen. A small ceremony in stillness. Here's your historical truth. Viking women were often buried with tools of their work, spindles, weaving tablets, knives, keys. These weren't just tokens of labor. They were symbols of identity. A woman's legacy wasn't built on conquest. It was built on care, creation, and continuity. And your strange little detail, some graves contain smooth stones burnished by years of handling thought to be touchstones used for calming or focus. Historians still argue whether they were healing tools, spiritual objects, or just rocks that felt good to hold. You suspect the answer lies in all three. You reach for yours, a pebble worn flat from years of fidgeting. It's not sacred. It's just yours. The wind knocks again, louder this time. You glance toward the door, not fearfully, just aware. You wonder how many winter storms your Longhouse has weathered, how many nights it has held generations just like this curled into warmth and memory. The fire flares again. You reach for your spindle not to work, but to feel its shape in your hand, its weight. You imagine the wool winding around it. Twist by twist, thread by thread, you see the fabric that doesn't exist yet, the hands that might wear it, the life that might depend on it. That's the thing about your world. It doesn't hand you peace. You have to spin it, stitch it, smoke it, salt it, boil it down to its bones, and guard it through the night. You rise once more, walk the Longhouse, tucking furs tighter, nudging a snoring child deeper into warmth, pressing your palm flat against the wooden door, still shut, still solid. You crawl back into your bed pile, dragging a rough wool blanket over your shoulders. The dog snuffles at your feet. The coals glow softly. Outside, the wind finally shifts again, easing, curling backward toward the sea like a tired fisherman calling it a night. You exhale. This day like the 100 before it is done, and now it's time for the wind down. The firelight flickers gently, casting shadows that stretch and yawn across the Longhouse walls. You feel it now, the heaviness behind your eyes, the warmth pooling at the base of your spine. Your body, softened by work, soothed by ritual, is ready to rest. The snow still falls outside, but slower now, gentler. The wind no longer knocks, it hums. A distant lullaby carried over the ice, brushing past your door with the hush of a mother's hand. Inside, everything is quiet. The coals shift with a soft sigh. The dog's breathing slows, even the children, who somehow manage to whisper through dreams, have gone still. You stretch one last time, fingers grazing the wool above your head. A half-stitched tunic waits for tomorrow. The goats, the spindle, the stew, all will greet you again with dawn. But now, none of it asks for your attention. You feel the rhythm of your own breath, steady and slow, like waves against the fjord. In, out, in, out. Each breath weaves another strand into the long thread of your life, tying you to every woman who's ever settled beside a fire. Hoping the roof holds through the storm, the world outside fades, turns soft, then still. The stars are there watching, distant, faithful. You close your eyes. Let the night hold you. Let the warmth wrap around your shoulders like the memory of a mother's song. You've done enough. You are enough. The hearth is strong. The house is safe. And for tonight, just tonight, the world asks nothing more of you than to drift. And so, you do.